The night the Duke of Ashworth said it, there were 14 people at the table. Clara Bowden counted them before the soup was served. She had always counted things: chairs, candles, faces, words. It was a habit her father had given her along with his ledgers, his debts, and his very particular way of watching a room without appearing to watch it at all. She was sitting near the middle of the table, which was neither an insult nor an honor. She had been placed between a viscount's elderly mother who was slightly deaf and a young baronet who had already had too much wine. Neither of them spoke to her. That was fine. Clara was not there to be spoken to. She was there because the Duchess had invited her, for reasons Clara had not yet fully understood, and because her father had raised her to accept certain invitations even when they felt like traps. The Duke of Ashworth sat at the head of the table. He was exactly what everyone said he was: tall, composed, and utterly certain that the room existed for his benefit. Clara had observed men like him before. They moved through the world as though the floor had been laid specifically for their footsteps. She had not expected him to notice her at all. That was her first mistake. She had said something, a quiet observation about the grain prices in the north, directed at no one in particular, because the conversation had briefly touched on the harvest, and she happened to know something accurate about it. It was not a bold statement. It was barely a statement at all. The Duke turned his head slowly, the way a man turns when something small and unexpected has caught his attention, and he looked at her for exactly 3 seconds. Then he turned to the rest of the table and said, with the ease of a man who had never once doubted his own voice, "Pay her no mind, she's quite forgettable." Someone laughed, then someone else. Then the table moved on the way tables do, and the conversation drifted back to hunting and London and who had been seen where with whom. Clara reached for her wine glass. Her hand was perfectly steady. She took a slow sip and set the glass down and looked at the candles in the center of the table and began, very quietly, to count the faces around her. 14. She counted them twice to be sure. Then she folded their names into the back of her mind, one by one, the way she folded columns of numbers into a ledger, neat, precise, and permanent. She did not look at the Duke again that evening. She didn't need to. Clara Bowden was 26 years old, unmarried, and in possession of something that made her considerably more dangerous than she appeared. She did not look dangerous. That had always been useful. She was the daughter of Robert Bowden, who had spent 30 years as a private financial agent to some of the wealthiest families in England. Not a solicitor, not a banker, but something quieter than both. A man who kept records that other men preferred not to keep themselves. A man who knew where the money had gone and, more importantly, where it had come from. Robert Bowden had been discreet to the point of invisibility, and he had raised his daughter to be exactly the same. He had died 4 months ago, and he had left her everything. Not a fortune. Robert Bowden had not been a wealthy man. What he had left Clara was something considerably more complicated than money: 3 locked boxes of ledgers, a small house in Kensington that was hers outright, and a letter that said in his careful handwriting, "These are not yours to use, Clara, but they are yours to keep. There is a difference. I trust you to know it." She had read that letter many times since his funeral. She was still deciding what she thought of it. The Duchess of Ashworth had sent her invitation 2 weeks after the burial, which Clara had found curious. The Duchess was not a close acquaintance. She had been her father's acquaintance, a woman who occasionally required the kind of quiet financial guidance that Robert Bowden had specialized in, the sort of guidance that never appeared in writing and was never discussed in company. Clara had met her perhaps 4 times. She had not expected to hear from her again. The invitation had been warm, almost affectionate. A small dinner, intimate. "I do hope you'll come, Miss Bowden. Your father was so dear to us." Clara had accepted, because her father had taught her that the invitations that felt like traps were usually the ones worth accepting. You learned more inside the trap than you ever did standing outside it. The Ashworth dining room was everything she had expected. High ceilings, too many candles, silver that caught the light in a way designed to make guests feel slightly inferior to the cutlery. The other guests were exactly the sort of people who filled rooms like this one. A lord and his sharp-eyed wife, a retired general who laughed too loudly, a young baronet with new money and old nerves, a widow of some rank whose name Clara recognized from her father's papers, and several others whose faces she categorized quickly and filed away. She was given a seat in the middle of the table. She observed the room, ate what was placed in front of her, and spoke only when spoken to, which was not often. The Viscount's mother on her left was hard of hearing and preferred to discuss her late husband's roses. The baronet on her right was working steadily through his third glass of claret and had stopped pretending to be interested in anyone else's conversation. Neither of them required much of her. The Duke sat at the head of the table and commanded it the way men like him always did without appearing to try. He was perhaps 35, with dark eyes and the kind of stillness that came not from calm but from absolute confidence that nothing in the room could surprise him. He spoke selectively and listened even more selectively, and when he did direct his attention at someone, they visibly straightened under it, as though they had been briefly illuminated. He did not direct his attention at Clara, not once in the first 2 hours. She had not minded. She was listening to everything else. It was during the third course that the conversation shifted to the northern counties, something about tenants and harvests, and the difficulty of managing estates at a distance. The general made a broad, confident claim about grain prices that was not quite accurate. Clara knew this because she had spent the previous week reconciling her father's accounts for a landowner in Yorkshire, and the figures were still fresh in her mind. She did not plan to speak, she simply did. It was a single sentence, offered quietly to the general, a gentle correction with the number she was certain of, nothing more. The table did not stop, the Duke's head turned. And then he said it. Pay her no mind, she's quite forgettable. The laughter was not unkind, exactly. It was the laughter of people who recognize a social signal and respond to it without thinking, the way a group of birds will all lift from a branch at once when one of them moves. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then the conversation moved on. Clara reached for her wine. She took one slow sip and set the glass down precisely where it had been before. The general did not correct his figures. No one mentioned the grain prices again. Clara finished her dinner. She listened to the rest of the evening with the same quiet attention she had brought to the beginning of it. She learned that the widow on the far end of the table had a son currently seeking a commission that required a letter of support from someone with influence. She learned that the sharp-eyed wife of the lord was not nearly as interested in her husband's conversation as she was in the Duke's solicitor, who sat 2 seats to her left. She learned that the Duchess of Ashworth watched her son with an expression that was not quite pride and not quite worry, something balanced carefully between the two. And she learned, though she had not needed to learn it, that she was the only person at that table who had already read the Duke of Ashworth's private financial records. Her father had kept them for 11 years. She had inherited them 4 months ago along with everything else. When the evening ended and the carriages were called, the Duchess pressed Clara's hand warmly at the door and said she hoped they might see each other again soon. Clara thanked her and meant none of it and stepped out into the cold London air. In the carriage home, she did not think about the Duke's words. She had already filed them away with the names and the faces and the figures she never forgot. She thought instead about her father's letter. These are not yours to use, Clara, but they are yours to keep. There is a difference, I trust you to know it. She looked out at the dark street and watched the lamplight pass. She was still deciding. Chapter 2, The Ledger. Clara did not open the boxes the night she came home from the Ashworth dinner. She made herself a cup of tea, sat by the fire in the small sitting room that still smelled faintly of her father's pipe tobacco, and let the evening settle around her like dust after a carriage has passed. She was not agitated. She had trained herself out of agitation years ago, the same way she had trained herself out of crying in front of people, and out of letting her face do things her mind had not approved first. She drank her tea and went to bed. She opened the boxes in the morning. There were 3 of them, identical in size, dark wood with brass fittings, each one locked with a small key that she kept on a ring with her house key and her father's pocket watch. She had not opened them since the week after the funeral, when she had done a careful inventory, and then locked them again and put them back on the shelf in her father's study, which was now her study, because she had not yet decided what to do about any of it. She carried all 3 to the desk, unlocked them one by one, and began to read. It took her most of the day. Robert Bowden had been, in the most precise sense of the word, meticulous. Every page was dated, every figure was sourced, every transaction was recorded in his small, even handwriting with the kind of clarity that suggested he had always known someone else might eventually need to read it. Whether that someone was meant to be Clara or a solicitor or a court of law, she could not say. Her father had not explained. Her father had rarely explained anything directly, when he could arrange for you to understand it yourself. The Ashworth records occupied the entirety of the second box and a portion of the third. Clara read them slowly. The Duke of Ashworth, the current Duke, James Ashworth, 34 years old, who had inherited the title 6 years ago when his father died of a stroke at his club, was not a poor man. That was important to understand first. He was not desperate or ruined or in the kind of financial distress that made men do foolish things in dark rooms. He had estates, income, investments. He had the appearance, from any ordinary vantage point, of a man in complete control of his position. The appearance was not entirely wrong, but it was not entirely right either. What the ledgers showed, carefully, quietly, across 11 years of her father's precise record-keeping, was that the Ashworth family had borrowed, not recklessly, not obviously, but consistently and substantially across 3 separate arrangements that had never been formalized through any bank or solicitor's office, because the late Duke had preferred to conduct certain matters through Robert Bowden rather than through channels that produced paperwork that other people might see. The amounts were significant. The terms had been private. And the repayments, Clara ran her finger down column after column of figures, had been irregular, partial, repeatedly deferred, always with agreement, always with good faith on both sides, always managed by her father with the quiet flexibility of a man who valued the relationship more than the schedule. Her father had trusted the Ashworths. That was clear in every page. What was also clear, and this was the part Clara sat with for a long time, her tea going cold beside her, was that none of this had ever been disclosed to anyone. Not to the current Duke's solicitors, not to the estate managers, possibly not even to the current Duke himself, who had inherited the title and the estates and, apparently, a set of private financial obligations that existed only in 3 locked wooden boxes in a dead man's study. Clara leaned back in her chair. Outside, the London street moved through its ordinary morning. A cart, a dog, 2 women with shopping baskets, the distant sound of a church bell marking the hour. She thought about her father's letter. These are not yours to use, Clara, but they are yours to keep. She understood him, she thought. She had always understood him. He had spent his life in the careful management of other people's secrets, and he had been proud of that, proud of the trust, proud of the discretion, proud of the particular honor of being the man who knew things and never used them. He had wanted her to carry that same pride. He had trusted her to carry it. She closed the ledger in her hands and held it for a moment. Then she thought about the Duke's voice at the dinner table, the easy certainty of it, the way the table had laughed without thinking, the way the conversation had moved on as though she had not spoken at all, as though she were furniture, as though she were a draft from an open window, noticed for a moment and then immediately forgotten. Pay her no mind, she's quite forgettable. Clara opened the ledger again. She did not feel angry exactly. Anger was too simple a word for what was moving through her, slow and deliberate and very, very clear. It was more like the feeling she got when she found an error in a column of figures, that particular combination of satisfaction and focus that came from knowing exactly where the mistake was and exactly what it would cost. She knew where the mistake was. The Duke of Ashworth had made it 3 weeks ago at his own dinner table, in front of 14 witnesses. He had looked at Clara Bowden and decided she was not worth remembering. That was the error. And errors, in Clara's experience, always had consequences. She did not decide anything that afternoon. She was not impulsive. She made herself another cup of tea, and she put the ledgers back in their boxes, and she locked each one carefully and put them back on the shelf, and she cooked herself a simple supper and read for an hour before bed. But that night, before she blew out the candle, she took the small notebook from her bedside table, the one she had always used for figures she wanted to keep close, and she wrote down 14 names. She wrote them in the same small, even hand her father had taught her. Then she closed the notebook, put it under her pillow, and slept better than she had in months. He arrived at Clara's door on a Tuesday morning, 11 days after the Ashworth dinner, carrying a leather case and an expression that had been carefully arranged to suggest both authority and goodwill. The expression, Clara thought, of a man who had practiced it in a mirror and was reasonably pleased with the result. She had been expecting someone. She had not known exactly when, but she had known. The Duchess's warm handshake at the door that evening had told her something. The invitation itself had told her something. And the ledgers, sitting in their locked boxes on her shelf, had told her the rest. Someone would come. Someone always came when the right kind of silence had been sitting in the wrong kind of room for too long. She showed Mr. Fitch into the sitting room and offered him tea, which he accepted, and a chair, which he took, and then she sat across from him with her hands folded in her lap and waited. He opened his case with the deliberate movements of a man who wanted you to notice how organized it was. "Miss Bowden," he began, "I represent the Duke of Ashworth in certain private matters." "I assumed as much," Clara said pleasantly. He glanced up. He had expected, she thought, either more nerves or more hostility. Her pleasantness appeared to inconvenience him slightly. He recovered quickly. He was a professional after all and continued. "His Grace is aware that you have recently come into possession of your late father's papers," Mr. Fitch said. "He wishes to express, first and foremost, his sincere condolences on your loss. Your father was a man of exceptional integrity, and his absence is genuinely felt." "That's very kind of His Grace," Clara said. "His Grace is also aware," Mr. Fitch continued, settling into the part he had clearly rehearsed more carefully, "that among your father's papers there may be certain documents of a private nature, documents relating to business arrangements between your father and the Ashworth family, arrangements of a sensitive character." "I see," Clara said. "His Grace would like to propose a resolution that he believes would be mutually beneficial." Mr. Fitch reached into his case and produced a folded document, and then, beside it, a banker's draft. He placed both on the table between them with the precision of a man laying down cards he was confident about. "The Duke is prepared to purchase your father's papers in their entirety. All records, all correspondence, all documents pertaining to Ashworth affairs. The sum offered is—" He named the figure. It was, Clara had to acknowledge, a serious sum. It was the kind of number that was designed to end conversations. It would keep her comfortable for years, perhaps decades, depending on how carefully she managed it. It was generous in the way that things are generous when the person offering them is also slightly frightened and is hoping you won't notice the fear underneath the generosity. Clara looked at the banker's draft for a moment. Then she looked up at Mr. Fitch. "No, thank you," she said. The silence that followed was very brief, but extremely full. Mr. Fitch blinked. It was the only crack in his professional composure, but it was enough. "I beg your pardon." "I said no thank you," Clara repeated, in exactly the same tone she might use to decline a second biscuit. "I appreciate His Grace's offer. Please tell him I said so, but I won't be selling my father's papers." Mr. Fitch set down his teacup. He was recalibrating, she could see, running through the possibilities, trying to locate her motive, trying to find the number she actually wanted so that he could go back to his client with a counteroffer and a strategy. It was what solicitors did. It was, she supposed, what she would have done. "Miss Bowden," he said carefully, "perhaps I haven't made the terms sufficiently clear. The Duke is being—" "Generous," Clara said. "Yes, I know exactly how generous he's being." She let that sit for just a moment. "That's why I said no," she added. Another silence. This one was different, less surprised, more calculating. Mr. Fitch was a smart man. She could see him arriving slowly at the correct conclusion, that she was not holding out for more money, that this was not a negotiation in the ordinary sense, that she wanted something the banker's draft could not provide, and that he did not yet know what it was. He closed his case. "May I ask," he said, with the careful neutrality of someone who knows they are on uncertain ground, "what it is you intend to do with the documents?" "Keep them," Clara said simply, "as my father instructed." "And nothing more." She smiled at him. It was a perfectly polite smile, the kind that gave nothing away and was designed to give nothing away. Her father had taught her that smile too, though he had never called it that. He had simply modeled it quietly across 30 years of sitting across tables from men who wanted things from him. "Mr. Fitch," she said, "my father spent his entire career managing other people's private affairs with complete discretion. He never used a single piece of information he was trusted with for his own benefit. Not once in 30 years. She paused. "I intend to honor that." Mr. Fitch looked at her steadily. "Then why not sell?" "Because," Clara said, "they were his, and now they're mine, and a thing can be kept without being used and without being sold." She picked up her teacup. "I'm sure His Grace understands the concept of holding something simply because it belongs to you." Mr. Fitch left 20 minutes later with the banker's draft still in his case, and an expression that had lost all of its earlier careful arrangement. He looked, Clara thought, like a man who had gone into a room expecting to buy something straightforward and had come out holding a question he didn't know how to answer. She watched his carriage from the window until it turned the corner. Then she went to her father's study, unlocked the second box, and took out the Ashworth ledger she had been reading most carefully. She sat down at the desk. She opened her small notebook to the page with 14 names. She looked at the first name on the list. Lady Harriet Mowbray, widow, Hanover Square. She had met Lady Mowbray twice, once at the Ashworth dinner, once years before at a charity function her father had attended. She was a sharp woman, observant, the kind of woman who noticed things at dinner tables and filed them away, much as Clara did. The kind of woman, Clara thought, who might enjoy a quiet afternoon call from an interesting acquaintance. She picked up her pen. She began to write a letter. Clara did not rush. That was the first thing to understand about what she did over the following 6 weeks. It was not a campaign. It was not a scheme exactly, though she supposed it might have looked like one from the outside. It was more like tending. The careful, patient tending of something that had been planted a long time ago and simply needed the right conditions to grow. She began with Lady Harriet Mowbray. The call lasted 2 hours. Clara brought a small box of candied ginger from a shop in Piccadilly that she happened to know Lady Mowbray was fond of. Her father had noted it once, in passing, the way he noted everything in passing. They sat in Lady Mowbray's pale yellow drawing room and talked about the autumn, and the difficulty of finding a reliable housekeeper, and the recent concert at the Hanover Square Rooms, and a dozen other things that meant very little and established, quietly and efficiently, that Clara Bowden was pleasant company and worth a second visit. She did not mention the Duke. She did not mention the dinner. She simply existed in that drawing room as a person worth remembering. That was all. For now, that was enough. She called on the others one by one across the following weeks, always with some small and appropriate reason, a mutual acquaintance, a book she thought they might enjoy, a note of condolence on some minor difficulty she had heard about through the ordinary channels of London society. She was never pushy and never sudden. She arrived, she was pleasant, she said something that made them think, and she left before she had overstayed. She called on the sharp-eyed wife of Lord Alderton, whose name was Frances, and who turned out to be considerably more interesting than her husband. They discovered a shared opinion about a recent parliamentary debate and talked for 3/4 of an hour about things women were not, strictly speaking, supposed to have opinions on. Frances Alderton looked at her at the end of the visit with an expression that suggested she had not expected to enjoy herself and was pleasantly irritated to find that she had. She called on old General Pembroke's wife, Margaret, a small brisk woman who collected botanical illustrations and had a laugh like a closing door. Margaret Pembroke had been at the far end of the dinner table and had almost certainly not heard the Duke's comment, but she had seen Clara's face in the moment after it, and she had the look of a woman who noticed faces. They talked about the General's health, which was declining, and about the difficulty of managing a large household with a reduced staff, and about a watercolor exhibition in Mayfair that they agreed they would both like to see. Before Clara left, Margaret Pembroke took her hand and said, "You must come again, Miss Bowden. I find I don't meet enough women who actually say what they think." "I'm not sure I said very much at all," Clara said. "No," Margaret agreed, "but what you didn't say was very interesting." Clara smiled all the way home in the carriage. The young baronet, Sir Edmund Hale, 23, too much money and not enough experience, was harder. He was not unkind, exactly, but he was the sort of young man who found women over 25 faintly puzzling, as though they had arrived at an age he hadn't quite planned for. Clara had tea with his mother instead, a capable woman named Ruth who managed her son's affairs with the focused energy of someone doing two people's work, and who recognized in Clara, almost immediately, a kindred spirit. Ruth Hale became, within a fortnight, one of Clara's most reliable sources of society gossip, not because Clara asked for it, but because Ruth Hale liked to talk and had very few people who listened as well as Clara did. It was Ruth who first mentioned, over a third cup of tea on a rainy Wednesday, that people had been talking about the Ashworth dinner. "Talking how?" Clara asked, in the tone of mild interest she had perfected over years of being her father's daughter. "Well," Ruth set down her cup, "several people have mentioned a young woman who said something rather clever about grain prices and was, not well received by the Duke." She looked at Clara carefully. "I believe that may have been you." "It may have been," Clara said. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with great precision, "He can be rather unkind, the Duke, when he doesn't think it matters." "Yes," Clara said, "I noticed that." Another silence, companionable this time. "I've also noticed," Ruth continued, almost to herself, "that you have called on nearly everyone who was at that dinner over the past few weeks." She picked up her teacup again. "I haven't mentioned it to anyone." "I appreciate that," Clara said. "I'm not sure you're doing anything wrong," Ruth said. "I'm not sure you're doing anything at all, technically speaking." She looked at Clara with something that was not quite admiration but was very close to it. "But you are doing something." Clara did not deny it. "My father always said," she offered instead, "that the most powerful thing a person can do is simply make sure they are remembered correctly." Ruth Hale considered this for a long moment. "Your father," she said finally, "sounds like he was a very wise man." He was, Clara said. He was also very patient. She meant it as a simple tribute, but she heard, even as she said it, the other meaning underneath, the meaning that was also true. Patience, that was what this was. That was what all of it was. She had not gone to a single event with the intention of saying anything damaging about the Duke of Ashworth. She had not repeated his words at the dinner table, or implied that he had behaved badly or suggested to anyone that they ought to think less of him. She had simply appeared consistently in the rooms where his name was occasionally spoken, and she had been unfailingly, unmistakably herself. And London society, which ran on observation the way a clock ran on springs, had begun to notice. She was aware of it in small ways at first, an extra warmth in a greeting, an invitation that arrived when she had not expected one, a note from Francis Alderton suggesting they attend the Mayfair exhibition together, which they did, and which resulted in their names appearing together in the social column of a newspaper, which Clara read without expression and filed away with everything else. And then, on a Thursday evening in early November, at a small musical gathering in Belgravia to which Clara had been invited by Lady Mowbray, she walked into a room and felt it change. It was subtle. It was the kind of thing you would not notice unless you were watching, as Clara always watched. A slight shift in posture, a turning of heads, the particular quality of attention that meant a room had registered your arrival and was deciding what to do about it. She was wearing the same dark green dress she had worn twice before, because she only had 3 evening dresses, and this was the one that fit her best, and she had stopped apologizing for that years ago. She crossed the room to greet Lady Mowbray, and on her way she passed 2 women she had never met who turned to each other as she passed, and one of them said, very quietly, but not quietly enough, "Is that the Bowden girl? I've heard she's remarkably." The rest was lost in the music starting up. Clara did not slow her step. She did not smile to herself, or at least she tried not to. She reached Lady Mowbray, who took her hands warmly and said, "Clara, my dear, come and meet Lord and Lady Cheswick. I've been telling them all about you." And across the room, standing near the window with a glass of wine he had barely touched, a tall man with dark eyes registered her arrival with an expression no one in the room was meant to see. Clara did not look at him. She knew he was there. She turned to Lord and Lady Cheswick and gave them her full attention and her best smile, and said something that made Lady Cheswick laugh and Lord Cheswick lean forward with interest, and she did not look at the window again for the rest of the evening. But she knew. She knew that the Duke of Ashworth had been watching her for 40 minutes, and that he had not looked away once. She counted. She always counted. The Duke of Ashworth did not like feeling uncertain. It was not something he had much practice with. James Ashworth had been raised in the particular way that men of his position were raised, with the unspoken but absolute conviction that the world was arranged in a logical order, that he occupied a specific and unassailable place within that order, and that most of the difficulties a man might encounter in life could be resolved through the correct application of authority, money, or patience. He was not arrogant in the loud, theatrical way of some men he knew. He did not need to be. His certainty was quieter than that, bone-deep, structural, the kind of certainty that doesn't announce itself because it has never had reason to doubt itself. He had been certain on the night of his mother's dinner that the woman sitting near the middle of the table was exactly what she appeared to be, the daughter of a moderately useful financial agent, invited out of some sentimental impulse of his mother's, pleasant enough in an unremarkable way, and of no particular consequence to anyone at the table including herself. He had said what he said without cruelty and without particular intention. It had simply been true, or so he had believed. She was forgettable. He had forgotten her before the dessert course arrived. Or so he had believed. He was no longer certain what he believed. It had started with Fitch's visit, which had not gone the way Fitch visits usually went. Gerald Fitch was a competent man, careful, experienced, and very rarely surprised. He had returned from Kensington with the banker's draft untouched and an expression that James had never seen on his face before, which was the expression of a man who had encountered something he couldn't categorize. He had relayed the conversation with professional precision, including Miss Bowden's exact words, and when he finished he sat back and said, "She's not after money, Your Grace," in the tone of a man reporting a geological anomaly. "Then what is she after?" James had asked. Fitch had looked at him with the careful neutrality of a man who has an opinion and is deciding whether his employer wants to hear it. "I'm not entirely sure," he said finally, "but I don't believe she intends to use the documents. She was very clear about that." "People who don't intend to use something don't usually refuse to sell it," James said. "No," Fitch agreed, "they don't." James had dismissed him and sat alone for a while with that thought. He had made inquiries after that, discreet ones, the kind he was practiced at making. He had learned that Clara Bowden was 26, unmarried, living alone in her late father's house in Kensington, possessed of a modest income from her father's estate and no other obvious means. She had no powerful connections, no title, no particular social standing. She moved in society at the outer edges, present at certain events, known to certain people, but not central to anything. She was not, by any measurable standard, a woman who should concern him. And yet, Ruth Hale had mentioned her at a dinner in October, which James had not attended but whose conversation had been reported to him afterward through the ordinary channels of a man who liked to know what was being said in rooms he wasn't in. Ruth Hale was not a gossip in the malicious sense, but she talked, and what she had said about Clara Bowden was that she was. The word Ruth had apparently used was *formidable*, which James had found interesting because it was not the word you used about someone you had only just met unless they had given you genuine reason for it. Then there was the Belgravia gathering. He had gone because Lady Mowbray had specifically requested his attendance, and Lady Mowbray was not someone whose specific requests he ignored without consequence. He had not expected Clara Bowden to be there. When she walked in, he had experienced something he didn't immediately have a name for, a kind of sharpening of attention, sudden and involuntary, like a man who hears his name spoken in a room where he thought no one knew him. She had not looked at him. That was the thing he kept returning to in the days that followed. She had not looked at him once. She had moved through that room with a composure that was not performance. He knew the difference. He had watched enough people perform composure to recognize the real thing, and she had given her attention entirely to the people she spoke with, and the people she spoke with had visibly brightened under it, the way plants turn toward a light source without quite knowing they're doing it. He had watched her for the better part of an hour. She had not once glanced toward the window. He found this, against all reason, slightly maddening. They met properly, or rather, they occupied the same small space of a room in a way that made conversation unavoidable, at a reception at the Alderton House on the 15th of November. James arrived late, which he did deliberately, and which no one commented on, because no one commented on the deliberate habits of a duke. The rooms were already full when he arrived, warm with candlelight, and the specific low roar of 200 people all being charming at each other simultaneously. He moved through the crowd with the ease of long practice, speaking to the people he needed to speak to, extracting himself from the people he didn't, accepting a glass of wine he didn't particularly want because it gave his hand something to do. He found her, or rather she found him, in the smaller of the two reception rooms, near a bookcase that no one was paying attention to because there was a more interesting conversation happening near the fireplace. She was standing slightly apart from the main cluster of people, reading the spines of the books with what appeared to be genuine interest, and she did not look up when he approached. He stopped beside her. A moment passed. "Miss Bowden," he said. "Your Grace," she said, without looking up from the books. Another moment. He was not accustomed to people not looking at him when he spoke to them. It was a small thing, but it registered. "You're finding the Alderton Library interesting," he said. "I'm finding this particular shelf interesting," she said. "Lord Alderton appears to have bought these books by the yard rather than by the title. 3 volumes on Roman aqueducts, a French novel from 1803, something about the migratory habits of northern birds, and a complete set of agricultural almanacs from 1821 to 1829. She tilted her head slightly. "They have nothing in common except height." James looked at the shelf. She was entirely correct. "Perhaps he simply likes uniformity," he said. "Perhaps," she agreed pleasantly. "Or perhaps he wanted a wall that looked like the wall of a man who reads, without requiring him to actually do it." She said it without any particular edge, in exactly the tone she might use to comment on the weather, and yet James found himself standing very still for a moment in the way that you stand still when something small has landed precisely. He turned to look at her properly. She was looking at the books. "Miss Bowden," he said, and something in his voice must have changed because she did look at him then, with those steady gray eyes that he had apparently not looked at carefully enough the first time. "I find that I've been hearing your name rather frequently of late." "Have you?" she said mildly. "From Lady Mowbray, from Mrs. Alderton, from at least 3 other people I can think of without trying." He paused. "For someone who was, as I understand it, not especially well connected in London, you seem to have become rather well connected in a very short time." "People have been very kind," Clara said. "Yes," James said. "They have. I'm curious why." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't read, not because it was hidden exactly, but because it was layered in a way he hadn't anticipated. There was something underneath the pleasantness. Not hostility, something more patient than that. "I imagine," she said, "because I listen to them. People are generally fond of someone who listens." "And what do you do with what you hear?" "Remember it," she said simply. The word landed between them, with a weight she had clearly intended. James felt something tighten in his chest, not quite guilt, not quite anger, something that lived in the narrow territory between the two. He was not a man who apologized easily. He had never had much occasion to practice it. But he was also, underneath all the certainty and the composure and the bone-deep conviction of his own position, intelligent enough to know when he had been not outmaneuvered exactly. Something more precise than that. He had made an error of assessment. He was looking at the evidence of it. "Miss Bowden," he said, and his voice was different now, quieter, the performance of authority stripped back to something more direct. "What exactly are you doing?" She turned from the bookcase to face him fully for the first time, and he was struck again by the thing he had missed entirely at the dinner table, the absolute steadiness of her. Not cold, not hard, simply settled in herself in a way that most people were not, in a way that he was not certain he was himself on the honest days. "I'm simply being memorable, Your Grace," she said. She said it without triumph. That was the part that stayed with him longest afterward. There was no victory in her voice, no sharpness, no desire to twist the blade. She said it the way you state a fact, calmly, clearly, and without any apparent need for him to feel it as a wound, even though he did. She excused herself a few moments later, with perfect courtesy, and moved back toward the main room. James stayed where he was for longer than he should have, looking at the shelf of mismatched books. He thought about the grain prices she had corrected. She had been right. He had looked it up afterward, in the way you look something up when you are hoping to find it wrong and don't want to admit you're hoping that. The general's figure had been off by nearly 12%. Clara Bowden's quiet correction had been accurate to the decimal. He had dismissed her before she finished the sentence. He set down his untouched wine on the shelf, beside the agricultural almanacs. He left the reception shortly afterward, earlier than was his custom, and rode home through the cold November streets with the particular discomfort of a man who has always been certain of his own judgment and has just been handed a reason to doubt it. He did not sleep well. In the morning, he sent a note to Fitch. He wanted, he wrote, to know everything there was to know about Robert Bowden and his daughter. Everything. The report came back within a week, and James read it twice. Robert Bowden had been, by every account Fitch could gather, a man of complete integrity. Not wealthy, not powerful, but trusted by people who were both of those things, trusted with information and arrangements and private affairs that required absolute discretion. He had never betrayed a confidence. He had never used his position for personal gain. He had been, in the particular world he inhabited, something close to irreplaceable, which was why his death had been noted quietly and genuinely by people who rarely noted anyone's death genuinely. His daughter had managed his account since she was 17. She had received no formal education beyond what her father had provided, which had apparently been considerable. She spoke 3 languages. She had kept the books for at least 6 of her father's clients in the years before his death. She had done so accurately, discreetly, and without any compensation beyond her father's roof and her father's name. She was, Fitch noted in his careful way at the bottom of the report, in a somewhat precarious financial position. The house was hers outright. The income from her father's estate was modest. She had no other prospects that he could identify and no family beyond a distant cousin in Bath who appeared to have no interest in her situation. James put down the report. He thought about a woman who had grown up managing other people's money with perfect accuracy and had been offered a sum that would have secured her future for decades and had turned it down without a moment's hesitation. He thought about 14 names in a small notebook. He thought about the way she had stood in the Alderton house and said, "I'm simply being memorable," without a single note of satisfaction in her voice. He sat at his desk for a long time. Then he did something he had not done in a very long time. He picked up his pen and he began to write a letter himself, not to Fitch, not to his estate manager, not to anyone who worked for him. He wrote it to Clara Bowden. He asked if she would receive him. He sent it before he could think better of it, which was not how he usually did things. And then he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling and experienced the unfamiliar and not entirely unpleasant sensation of not knowing what was going to happen next. Her reply came the following afternoon. It was 4 lines. The handwriting was very clear. Dear Your Grace asterisk. I will receive you on Thursday at 3 o'clock. I serve tea, not answers. Yours sincerely, Clara Bowden. James read it 3 times. Then, for the first time in longer than he could remember, he laughed, a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, alone in his study with no one to see it. He was at her door on Thursday at precisely 3 o'clock. Thursday came with the kind of gray, heavy sky that London did better than anywhere else in the world, not quite raining, not quite not raining, the air sitting thick and damp against the windows, and the streets below running dark with the previous night's weather. Clara had been up since 6. She had not slept particularly well, which she acknowledged without indulging, the way she acknowledged most things that were inconvenient, noted, filed, set aside. She had read his letter 4 times. She had written her reply once, immediately, without revision, which was unlike her. She revised everything. She had learned from her father that the first version of a thing was almost never the right version, that clarity required patience, that precision required drafts. But the reply to the Duke's letter had arrived in her mind fully formed, and she had written it straight onto the good paper without stopping and sealed it before she could second-guess herself. I serve tea, not answers. She had meant it as a boundary. She had also meant it as an invitation. She was aware that it was both of these things simultaneously, and that this was either very clever or very foolish, and she was not yet certain which. She made the house ready the way she always made it ready for visitors, not by disguising it, but by making sure it was entirely and unapologetically itself. The sitting room was small, well kept, and full of books. There were no flowers because she hadn't bought any and she wasn't going to buy any specifically for him. The tea service was her mother's, blue and white, slightly old-fashioned, one cup with a hairline crack in the handle that she had always loved too much to replace. She built up the fire because the day was cold, and she saw no reason for either of them to be uncomfortable. And then she sat down with a book at 10 minutes to 3 and tried to read it and managed about 4 sentences before she heard the knock at the door. She gave it a measured moment before she went to answer it herself, because she had no housekeeper and she was not going to pretend otherwise. The Duke of Ashworth on the doorstep of a small house in Kensington was a slightly different creature from the Duke of Ashworth at the head of his own dinner table. He was still tall. He was still composed in that particular structural way of his, the way that wasn't performance but architecture, built into him at some foundational level that Clara suspected even he couldn't fully access. But there was something different about him in this context, something she registered the moment she opened the door and found him standing there without a carriage waiting, and without Fitch, and without any of the apparatus of his position. He had come alone. He was wearing a coat that was good but not ostentatious, and he was holding his hat in his hands, which she noticed because it was a small thing that meant something. A man who takes his hat off before he's been invited to come in is a man who has thought about what kind of visit this is going to be. "Miss Bowden," he said. "Your Grace," she said, "please come in." She led him to the sitting room, and he entered it without comment, which she appreciated. Men of his position sometimes couldn't resist commenting on smaller rooms, not always unkindly, but in a way that reminded you of the difference between your world and theirs, sometimes deliberately, sometimes simply because they had no awareness that they were doing it. James Ashworth looked at her sitting room the way a person looks at a room they are genuinely trying to understand, and he sat in the chair she indicated and accepted the tea she poured, without the faint condescension that she had half expected. They were quiet for a moment, the fire settled. Outside, the gray sky pressed against the window. "You said you wouldn't provide answers," he said. "I said I served tea," she agreed. "I didn't say I wouldn't talk." "There's a distinction." "There's always a distinction," Clara said, "between being asked something and choosing to answer it." He looked at her steadily. "Then I won't ask," he said. "I'll tell you something instead." She waited. "I read my father's correspondence last week," James said. "All of it, the private correspondence, the records he kept separately from the estate books. It took me 3 days. He set down his teacup with the careful precision of someone who is choosing their movements deliberately. "I found your father's name in it more times than I could count, going back 20 years. He paused. "The arrangements they had, the financial arrangements, I was not aware of them. I want to be clear about that. When Fitch came to you, it was because I had been told they existed, not because I understood the full extent of them." "Who told you?" Clara asked. "My mother," he said. Clara absorbed this without expression, though it confirmed something she had suspected since the night of the dinner, since the warmth of the Duchess's handshake at the door, since the particular quality of the invitation itself. "She told you after the dinner," Clara said. "It was not a question." "Yes." "Not before." "No." Something moved across his face, not quite discomfort, but close to it. "I believe she intended the dinner as an opportunity for me to meet you, under circumstances that she thought might be favorable." He said the last word with a very slight dryness that suggested he was aware of the irony of it. "Favorable," Clara repeated in the same tone. "Yes," he met her eyes. She was not pleased with how the evening went. "I imagine not," Clara said. Another silence. The fire crackled. She refilled his cup without being asked because it was empty, and because it gave her a moment to look at her own hands and make sure they were steady, which they were. "Miss Bowden," he said, and his voice had shifted into the register she had heard once before at the Alderton house, the one with the performance stripped out of it, the one that was simply a man talking. "I owe you an apology." "Yes," she said, "you do." He seemed slightly surprised that she didn't deflect it, that she didn't say, "Oh," think nothing of it, or it was a small thing, or any of the dozen phrases women used to make men comfortable with the things they had done to them. She watched him register her directness and recalibrate, and she watched him decide that he respected it even though it made things harder. "What I said at the dinner table was unkind," he said. "It was also, I have come to understand, incorrect, which is perhaps the part that troubles me more if I'm being honest." "Why?" Clara asked. "Because unkindness can be a failure of manners," he said. "Incorrectness is a failure of judgment. I prefer to believe my judgment is reliable." "And now you're not sure it is." "No," he said, "I'm not sure it is." She looked at him for a long moment. He did not look away, which she noted. Most people looked away when she looked at them for too long. It made them uncomfortable, that kind of steady attention. He returned it without apparent difficulty, and she wondered, not for the first time, what it would be like to be a person who had grown up so entirely certain of their place in the world that even discomfort couldn't make them flinch. She thought about what she had planned. She had planned it carefully over the past week since she had known he was coming. She had thought about what she wanted from this conversation and what she did not want, and what she was willing to say and what she was not. She had made a list, in the small notebook, in the same careful handwriting she used for everything else. She was not impulsive. She did not do things without thinking them through. And yet she sat now in her sitting room across from a man who had just apologized to her with more genuine directness than she had expected, and she found that the list felt slightly different than it had when she wrote it. Not wrong, just different. She put down her own teacup. "Your Grace," she said, "I want to tell you something about my father." He listened. That was what she noticed first. He actually listened, with the quality of attention that she recognized because it was the same quality she brought to listening herself, the kind that wasn't waiting for its turn to speak, but was genuinely receiving what was being said. She told him about Robert Bowden, not the professional version, not the brief biography that Fitch had no doubt assembled and delivered, the real version. The man who had sat at this same desk in this same room for 30 years and kept other people's secrets with a care that went beyond professionalism into something closer to vocation. The man who had raised her to understand that information was not power, that using information as power was a corruption of the thing itself, that the value of knowing something was not what you could do with it, but simply the clarity it gave you. She told him about the ledgers, not the contents, she was not ready for that, and he did not ask, but what they represented. 30 years of trust, kept in 3 locked boxes, passed to her with a letter that said asterisk, "These are not yours to use." "And are you going to," James asked, "use them?" "No," Clara said, and she meant it, she realized, more completely than she had understood when she said it to Fitch. "No, I'm not." "Then what do you want?" he asked, directly, simply, without Fitch's careful professional framing, just the question plain. Clara looked at the fire for a moment. "I want what was taken from me at your dinner table," she said, "which was not money and not position. It was something considerably simpler than either of those things." He was quiet, waiting. "I want to be seen," she said, "correctly by the people who were in that room." She looked back at him, not pitied, not managed, seen. She had not planned what happened next. She had planned, in fact, something considerably more structured. Something that she had thought through across several evenings with her notebook and her careful handwriting and her father's voice in her head telling her to think before she moved. She had planned to let the conversation develop naturally, to say what she had said, to allow the Duke to respond, and then to tell him quietly and clearly what she wanted, which was an acknowledgement, public and genuine, in front of the people who had been at that table, that he had been wrong. That was the plan. What disrupted the plan was the letter that arrived at her door at 20 minutes past 3, carried by a boy from the Duchess of Ashworth's household, addressed to Clara in handwriting she did not recognize, and containing 6 lines that changed the shape of the afternoon entirely. She read it once. Then she set it on the table between them. James read it without touching it, leaning forward slightly, and she watched his face as he read, watched the stillness that was his default expression give way to something harder and less controlled, something she thought might be the closest he came to anger. The letter was from the Duchess. It was not a warm letter. It said, in language that was polite on the surface and something considerably colder underneath, that Miss Bowden had been given a fair and generous offer which she had declined without good reason, that her subsequent behavior in London society, her calls, her appearances, her cultivated friendships, suggested a campaign of a most unbecoming nature, and that the Duchess considered it her duty to inform Miss Bowden that certain people in society had begun to form opinions about her conduct that she might find uncomfortable. It said that a woman in Miss Bowden's position, without family, without title, without means, would be wise to consider the fragility of the social goodwill she had recently accumulated, and the speed with which such goodwill could be reversed by the right word from the right person. It said, in its final line, in the particular language of a woman who had spent 50 years delivering threats wrapped in silk, "I do hope you will reconsider your position, Miss Bowden, before positions become considerably more difficult to hold." Clara had read it without expression the first time. She watched James read it now and found that she did not need to say anything. She simply watched his face. He sat back. He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was very level, in the particular way that voices go level when what is underneath them is not level at all. "I did not know she sent this," he said. "I know," Clara said. "I could tell. I want to be clear." "You don't need to be," she said. "I believe you." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because a man who had authorized this letter," Clara said carefully, "would not have come here today and apologized without being asked to." Another silence. James looked at the letter on the table between them as though it were something he would like to remove from the room. "What are you going to do?" he asked. Clara picked up the letter, folded it once along its original crease, and set it aside. "Nothing different than I was already going to do," she said. "Which is?" She looked at him with those steady gray eyes that he had not looked at carefully enough the first time, and would not, he thought, make the mistake of underestimating again. "Your Grace," she said, "there were 14 people at your dinner table. I have spent the past 6 weeks making sure that every single one of them knows my name, knows my face, and has a reason to think well of me." She paused. "I don't need your mother's goodwill. I never did. What I need is what I told you I needed, a public acknowledgement in front of those 14 people that what was said at that table was wrong." "And the ledgers?" he asked. "Are mine," she said, "and they will remain mine, and I will keep them exactly as my father kept them, which is to say, locked, private, and unused." She held his gaze. "I am not your mother, your Grace. I don't deliver threats wrapped in courtesy letters. If I wanted to use those ledgers against you, I would have done it already, and you would have known exactly what I was doing and why." James was quiet for a very long time. Outside the window, the London afternoon had gone darker, the gray sky pressing lower, and the first real rain of the evening had begun to tap against the glass in a quiet, insistent rhythm. "The 14 people," he said finally. "How would you propose to arrange that?" "Your mother hosts a Christmas dinner every year," Clara said. "She has done so for 30 years. She invites the same families, the same faces." She paused. "Most of them were at the table in October." James looked at her with an expression she was only beginning to learn how to read, complex, layered, moving through several things at once. "You want me to arrange an invitation," he said. "I want you to attend," Clara said, "and I want you to say in front of the people who were there what you told me today." She let that sit for a moment. "The rest your mother can arrange however she likes." "My mother," James said slowly, "will not be pleased." "No," Clara agreed, "she won't." Something shifted in his expression then, something she had not expected, something that was almost, in a particular quiet way, like admiration. "Miss Bowden," he said, "can I ask you something?" "You can ask," she said. "Did you plan all of this, from the beginning, from the night of the dinner?" Clara considered the question honestly, the way she considered everything honestly when she had the privacy to do so. "I planned to survive it," she said finally. "The rest developed as it went." He nodded slowly, as though this were the answer he had expected, and also the answer he found most interesting. He left at 4:30, when the rain had properly arrived, and his coat was going to be inadequate for it, and she stood at the window and watched him walk to the corner where she assumed a carriage was waiting, and she watched the rain darken his coat before he reached it, and she thought about the expression on his face when he read his mother's letter. She thought about the way he had said, "I did not know she sent this," simply, directly, with no performance attached to it. She picked up her notebook from the desk. She looked at the list of 14 names. Beside the first name, Lady Harriet Mowbray, she had written, in very small letters, a number. The number of days since the dinner. 53 days. She closed the notebook. She thought about what came next. She thought about a woman who had spent her whole life being invisible in rooms full of people who had decided, before she opened her mouth, that she had nothing worth saying. She thought about her father's letter. "These are not yours to use, Clara, but they are yours to keep. There is a difference. I trust you to know it." She had known it, she thought. She had always known it. The difference was not what you did with what you held. The difference was what holding it made you. She went to her desk and sat down, and in the small notebook, beneath the list of 14 names, she wrote 4 words. "Almost, not quite yet." Then she closed it and went to make herself supper and let the rain do what it wanted with the rest of the evening. The Duchess of Ashworth's Christmas dinner was held on the 19th of December. It had been held on the 19th of December for 31 consecutive years, with the exception of 1841, when the late Duke had been ill, and the house had been quiet, and the Duchess had sat alone at the head of her table with a glass of Burgundy, and the particular expression of a woman who does not allow herself to be defeated by circumstances, but reserves the right to resent them privately. Clara had learned this detail from Lady Mowbray, who had been a guest at the Ashworth Christmas dinner for 22 of those 31 years, and who possessed the kind of institutional memory that made her, in Clara's estimation, one of the most valuable people in London to know. The invitation had arrived on the 1st of December. Clara had been standing at her desk when the boy delivered it. She had been in the middle of reconciling a column of figures for a small private client she had recently taken on, a widow in Marylebone who needed her late husband's accounts put in order and had been referred to Clara by Ruth Hale, which was the first piece of professional work Clara had received in her own name, and which she had accepted with a steadiness that did not entirely reflect what she felt about it. She had set down her pen and opened the envelope and read the invitation twice. It was in the Duchess's handwriting. It was warm, gracious, almost affectionate. It gave no indication whatsoever that the same hand had written the letter delivered to Clara's door on the afternoon of the Duke's visit, the letter that still sat in the second drawer of her desk, folded once along its crease, kept not as a weapon but as a record. Clara kept records. It was simply what she did. She had written her acceptance the same afternoon, and sent it before the boy had reached the end of her street. She spent the intervening weeks with a quietness that some people might have mistaken for calm, and that was, in fact, something more deliberate than calm. She continued her work for the widow in Marylebone. She took tea with Frances Alderton twice and with Ruth Hale once, and with Lady Mowbray on a rainy Thursday afternoon when the weather made everything feel closer and more honest than usual. She did not call on anyone new. She did not extend her reach. She had extended it as far as she needed to, and now she simply maintained. She saw James Ashworth once in that period, at a concert in Mayfair that they had both been invited to separately and arrived at separately, and which neither of them had known the other would attend. He had found her in the interval, threading through the crowd with a purposefulness that suggested he had been looking, and he had stood beside her near a window with a glass of wine in his hand and said, without preamble. She agreed. "I know," Clara said. "I received the invitation." She was not, he paused, considered. It required some conversation. "I imagine it did," Clara said. He looked at her sideways. "You don't seem surprised." "I'm not surprised," Clara said. "I'm relieved there's a difference." He was quiet for a moment. The music from the hall drifted through the open door, something slow and precise and very old. "Miss Bowden," he said, "can I ask you something?" "You asked me that before," she said, and then asked it anyway regardless of my answer. "Yes," he said, and something in his face moved in a way that she was beginning to recognize, a slight relaxation around the eyes, a fractional shift in the line of his mouth, the expression of a man who is finding something genuinely amusing and is not entirely used to the experience. "I did. Are you going to make the same distinction this time?" "Ask and find out," she said. "Are you frightened," he said, "of the dinner, of what you've asked me to do?" Clara looked at the window for a moment. Outside, the December street was dark and cold and bright with lamplight, and she could see her own faint reflection in the glass. A woman in a green dress holding a glass she hadn't drunk from, her face composed and her eyes giving nothing obvious away. "Yes," she said. She said it simply, without apology or qualification, because she had decided some time ago that honesty was easier to maintain than its alternatives and considerably less exhausting. "I'm frightened that it will go wrong. I'm frightened that it will embarrass both of us. I'm frightened that the 14 people in that room will find the whole thing awkward and wrong-footed, and that it will undo everything I've spent 2 months carefully building." She paused. "And I'm frightened that even if it goes right, it won't feel the way I've been imagining it will feel." He was quiet for a moment. "What have you been imagining it will feel?" he asked. "Like enough," she said, "like it was worth it." He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she couldn't entirely read, something serious and attentive, and slightly unguarded in a way she was not sure he was aware of. "It will be," he said, and he said it not in the confident, automatic tone of a man reassuring a woman because that is what men do, but in the slower, more deliberate tone of a man who has thought about it and arrived at a conclusion he is willing to stand behind. Clara looked at him. "How do you know?" she said. "Because," James said, "I've been thinking about what I'm going to say every day since I left your house." He turned the wine glass in his hand. A man who has thought that carefully about an apology generally manages to mean it. The interval ended. They went back to their separate seats. But Clara sat through the second half of the concert with the music washing over her and something settled and warm sitting in her chest that she didn't entirely have a name for yet. And she decided not to name it, not tonight, and simply let it be there. The 19th of December arrived with frost. Clara was up at 5, which was not unusual, and dressed by 7, which gave her 8 hours to do nothing useful, and she knew it, and she worked anyway, figures, correspondence, the Marylebone accounts, and drank too much tea and at 2 o'clock in the afternoon put down her pen and went to her bedroom and stood in front of the small mirror above the washstand and looked at herself for a long moment. She had 3 evening dresses. She had worn the dark green one to the Belgravia gathering and to the concert and to the Alderton reception. She had worn the dark blue one to two other events that mattered less. The third was one she had not worn since her father's last good year, when he had taken her to a dinner in the city, and she had sat beside a shipping magnate and talked about Baltic trade routes and drunk champagne for the first time and come home flushed and bright-eyed and more alive than she usually permitted herself to feel in public. It was ivory, simple, cut well, which mattered more than decoration. Her mother's pearls, which were real and which she wore rarely because they felt like saving something precious for ordinary days, and she had always believed that ordinary days deserved better than that. But tonight she put them on because tonight was not ordinary. She looked at herself in the mirror for one more moment. Then she went downstairs and waited for the carriage she had arranged, a small extravagance she had allowed herself, because she was not going to arrive at the Ashworth house in a hackney cab, not tonight. And while she waited, she sat very still in the sitting room with her hands in her lap and let herself feel, just briefly and privately, everything she usually kept filed and organized and out of the way. The fear, the grief that was still there underneath everything, quiet and persistent, her father's absence sitting in every room of the house like a piece of furniture you kept forgetting to see until you suddenly saw it. The strange compound feeling of being about to step into a room where someone had once looked at her and decided she wasn't worth remembering, and knowing that this time, she was walking in as someone completely different, not because she had changed, because they had finally been given the information required to see her correctly. She thought about her father. She thought about what he would say if he could see her, sitting in his house in his chair in her mother's pearls, about to go to the Ashworth Christmas dinner at the invitation of the man, whose family had borrowed quietly and substantially from him for 11 years, and who had called his daughter Forgettable at a dinner table. She thought he would probably say something measured and careful about choosing one's moments and the importance of restraint and the long view. And then she thought he would probably also, somewhere underneath all of that, be quietly and completely pleased. The carriage arrived at 7:30. The Ashworth house was lit from within like something out of a painting. Every window blazed. The entrance hall, when the door opened and she was shown in, smelled of pine and candle wax and something warm and spiced that drifted from somewhere deeper in the house. The staff were impeccable. The flowers were extraordinary, great arrangements of winter greenery and white roses that cost more than Clara's quarterly household accounts, and she noted this without resentment, simply as information. She was the 7th guest to arrive, which she had also calculated in advance. Not first, which would have made her seem eager, not last, which would have made her seem hesitant. 7th was correct. Lady Mowbray arrived 2 minutes after her and immediately took her arm, which Clara had not expected, and which moved her more than she would have predicted. The simple warmth of that gesture, this woman who owed her nothing and had chosen to like her anyway, taking her arm at the entrance of a room that was designed to make certain people feel small. Clara did not feel small. She was surprised to discover this. She had been prepared for the feeling and had arranged her defenses against it, and the defenses turned out to be unnecessary because the feeling simply wasn't there. She walked into the Ashworth drawing room on Lady Mowbray's arm, and the room received her. That was the only word for it, received her, the way a room receives someone it has been expecting. Faces turned. Names were spoken. She was greeted by Frances Alderton with a warmth that was genuine, and by Ruth Hale with a squeeze of the hand that said everything without saying anything, and by General Pembroke's wife, Margaret, with the brisk affection of a woman who has decided she likes you and sees no reason to be subtle about it. She greeted them all and moved through the room and did not look for him. She felt him, though. She had become, over the past 2 months, somewhat attuned to the particular quality of attention that James Ashworth brought to a room, the way his presence registered in the air around it, the way people oriented themselves slightly differently when he was present, The way the room's social geometry shifted to accommodate him without anyone quite deciding to let it. She had spent a long time learning to be immune to it, and had discovered that immunity was not quite the right goal, that you could be aware of a thing and simply not be governed by it, which was different and considerably more useful. He was standing near the fireplace with Lord Alderton and another man she didn't recognize, and he was not looking at her, and she moved to the other side of the room and began a conversation with Sir Edmund Hale, who had improved somewhat since October. He was still 23 and still uncertain of women over 25, but he had apparently had several conversations with his mother about Clara Bowden, and had arrived tonight prepared to find her interesting, which was, she supposed, a beginning. The Duchess received her last. Clara had been waiting for it, the moment when the Duchess would make her way across the room to where Clara was standing, because the Duchess would not let it happen any other way, would not allow Clara the position of approaching her, would manage the geography of it to maintain the appearance of control. Clara understood this and let it happen and stood exactly where she was and waited. The Duchess of Ashworth was 61 years old, silver-haired, dressed in deep burgundy that suited her, and possessed of the particular command that comes not from beauty or wealth alone, but from 50 years of practice at being the most important woman in every room she entered. She was formidable, in the complete and accurate sense of the word. Clara had known this from the beginning. She had never underestimated her. "Miss Bowden," the Duchess said, taking both of Clara's hands in hers with the warmth of a woman greeting a dear friend. Her smile was perfect. Her eyes were something else entirely. "Your Grace," Clara said, "thank you so much for your invitation. Your home is beautiful." "It's always such a pleasure to have new faces at Christmas," the Duchess said. "I do hope you'll find the evening enjoyable." "I'm sure I will," Clara said. They looked at each other for exactly 1 moment longer than the conversation required. Then the Duchess moved on, and Clara returned to Sir Edmund Hale and her glass of wine, and the evening continued around them both like a river, moving around two stones that are very aware of each other. Dinner was announced at 9. Clara found her place card and stood behind her chair and looked at the table. She was near the middle. Not the middle exactly, 1 seat to the right of it. She looked at her place card, Miss C. Bowden *, written in the household's careful copperplate, and then she looked at the chair to her left, which was empty, and then she looked at the place card in front of that chair. His Grace, the Duke of Ashworth. She set down her wine glass very carefully. She had not known. He had not told her, and she had not asked, because she had been trying, genuinely trying, not to arrange this, not to choreograph it, to let what was going to happen simply happen on its own terms. She had told him what she wanted. She had left the rest to him. He had put himself next to her, at his own table. She did not look at him when he took his seat. She looked at the candles in the center of the table and counted them the way she counted everything, quietly, precisely, and because it was something to do with her hands that wasn't gripping the edge of the table. 9 candles. She counted them twice. The first course arrived. The conversation began its familiar elaborate machinery, voices and laughter, and the particular music of silver on china and wine being poured, and Clara was part of it, talking to the woman on her right about the winter concerts and to James, briefly and carefully, about nothing of consequence, and the meal moved through its courses the way meals did, and all the while she was aware of the particular quality of the evening, the thing underneath the surface of it, sitting in the room with them like a held breath. It happened between the 3rd and 4th courses. The table had reached one of those natural pauses that long dinners produce, a moment when several conversations end simultaneously, and the room rests for just a beat before resuming. These moments were usually filled immediately by whoever was most comfortable with silence, which in this room was generally the Duchess. James filled it first. He set down his wine glass, and he did not clear his throat or signal the table or ask for attention in any formal way. He simply spoke, in the voice that carried without effort, the voice that rooms organized themselves around. "I want to say something," he said. The table turned. It always turned for him. That was the particular alchemy of his position. Rooms listened before they knew what they were listening to. Clara looked at the candles. "Some of you were at a dinner I hosted in October," James said. "Miss Bowden was among the guests." A brief pause. "During that evening she made an observation, an accurate one as it turned out, and I responded to it in a way that was both unkind and incorrect." He did not look at her while he said this. He looked at the table, at the faces around it, at the people he was speaking to, because he understood, Clara thought, that this was not a private apology. It had never been a private apology. It had always been about the witnesses. "I said something dismissive. Several of you heard it. I want you to hear this as well." Now he looked at her. "Miss Bowden, I was wrong. What I said was wrong, and I should have said so much sooner than this." The table was completely quiet. Clara looked at him. She had prepared for this moment across weeks of careful thought, and she had imagined it in many versions, and in none of the versions had she imagined that it would feel quite like this. Not triumphant, not relieved, not even particularly vindicated in the way she had expected vindication to feel. It felt like something simpler than all of that. It felt like a window being opened in a room that has been closed for too long. Just air. Just the ordinary, essential thing that had been missing. She had promised herself she would not cry, and she did not cry. "Thank you," she said, quietly, directly to him alone. That was honestly said. Another silence. And then Lady Mowbray, who had been at this table many times across many years and who had a gift for the right word at the right moment, said simply, "Here, here," in a tone that was warm and final, and closed the moment exactly as it should be closed. The fourth course arrived. The conversation resumed. Clara picked up her fork and looked at her plate and felt, moving through her slowly and completely, the thing she had been afraid might not come. The feeling she had described to James at the concert, the feeling she had barely dared name even to herself. Like enough. Like it was worth it. It was both of those things. It was, if she was being fully honest with herself, and she was always, in private, fully honest with herself, considerably more than both of those things. But she held that knowledge quietly and let the dinner continue around her, and talked to the woman on her right about the winter concerts and to James, at intervals, about things that mattered more than they appeared to. And she drank her wine and she ate her food, and she let the evening be exactly what it was. 14 people were at that table. She did not count them this time. She already knew. The guests began leaving at 11. Clara collected her coat and her gloves and said her goodbyes with the warmth and composure that had become, over the past 2 months, genuinely her own, not performance, not strategy, simply who she was when she was allowed to be it without someone deciding in advance that she wasn't worth the attention. The Duchess said goodnight to her with a smile that was, if Clara was not mistaken, very slightly different from the one she had deployed at the beginning of the evening. Not warm, exactly. Not yet. But revised. The smile of a woman who has encountered something she had not fully anticipated and is too intelligent to pretend otherwise. Clara appreciated that more than she would have appreciated false warmth. James found her in the entrance hall. He was not wearing his host's expression, the composed, public face that he wore through the evening with such practiced ease. He looked, she thought, like a man who has done something difficult and is standing on the other side of it, slightly lighter than he was before. "Miss Bowden," he said. "Your Grace," she said. They stood for a moment in the entrance hall of his house, with the sound of departing guests around them, and the candles burning lower, and the smell of pine and winter, and the particular feeling of an evening that has done what it was supposed to do, and is now gently and correctly ending. "Was it enough?" he asked, quietly, just for her. Clara looked at him. Yes, she said, and then because she was always honest when it mattered, more than enough. He nodded slowly. Then he said, with a carefulness that told her he had been considering how to say it, I find that I would very much like to call on you, not in any official capacity, not through Fitch, a pause, simply call on you. Clara was quiet for a moment. Outside, she could hear her carriage being brought round. The cold air came in briefly as another guest departed, and the candles in the hall shifted in it, all together, like a field of wheat in a passing wind. Then do, she said. She put on her gloves and walked out into the December night. 1 year later, the 19th of December came again with frost, as it had the year before. Clara noticed this from her desk at 7 in the morning, where she was finishing the last of the quarterly accounts for 3 private clients. The widow in Marylebone, a retired solicitor in Bloomsbury who had been referred by Ruth Hale, and a young baronet in Surrey whose father had died leaving his estate in the kind of disorder that required someone with Clara's particular combination of patience and precision to untangle. She had built across the past year something small and real and entirely her own. Not a firm, not yet, but a practice, quiet and by referral only, the kind of work that found her rather than the other way around. Her father would have recognized it. She thought he would have approved. She finished the column she was working on, set down her pen, and looked out at the frost on the street below, and allowed herself just briefly to think about the year. James had called on her in January. Not through Fitch, not with any official capacity attached. He had simply appeared at her door on a Tuesday afternoon with his hat in his hands, and an expression that suggested he had thought carefully about whether to come and had come anyway. And she had let him in and made tea, and they had talked for 2 hours about nothing that was on any list she had ever made. And when he left, she had sat for a long time in the chair by the fire, and looked at the ceiling, and said nothing out loud. But something inside her had shifted in the manner of a door, opening onto a room you hadn't known was there. He came back the following Tuesday. And the one after that. By March it had become the kind of arrangement that neither of them had formally named, because naming it would have required a conversation that both of them were, for different reasons, moving towards slowly and carefully, the way you move towards something you want very much, and are therefore more frightened of than anything you want less. The Duchess had said nothing, which Clara understood to mean she was watching. Lady Mowbray had said quite a lot, but only to Clara, and only in the warm privacy of her yellow drawing room, and it was said with the particular delight of a woman who had lived long enough to recognize a good story when she was inside one. Ruth Hale had simply looked at Clara one afternoon in April with the expression of a woman who knows something and has decided to let you figure it out yourself, and said, "You look well, Miss Bowden," in a tone that contained approximately 40 separate observations. In May, James had shown her the ledgers. Not her father's, his own. The current estate accounts, the investments, the full picture of the Ashworth finances as they actually stood. He had brought them to her sitting room in a plain case and set them on her desk and said, with the directness that she had come to understand was his truest register, "I want you to see these, not because I need you to, because I want there to be nothing between us that requires a locked box." Clara had looked at the accounts for a long time. They were, she found, in better shape than her father's ledgers had suggested. James had, in the 2 years since inheriting, quietly and methodically addressed a significant portion of the inherited obligations. Not all of them, but enough that the picture was one of a man who understood the weight of what he had inherited and had been working, without fanfare or acknowledgement, to set it right. She had looked up from the ledgers and found him watching her with the careful attention of someone awaiting a verdict. "These are well managed," she said. "They could be better," he said. "Yes," she agreed, "they could." She looked at him. "Shall I tell you where?" Something shifted in his face, surprise, and then something warmer than surprise. "Please," he said. She had spent the next hour going through the accounts with him, column by column, the way she went through all accounts, precisely, without sentiment, calling the errors what they were and the strengths what they were. He had listened with complete attention, asked 3 questions that were exactly the right questions, and taken notes in a handwriting that was considerably less organized than hers, which she had noted without comment. When she finished, he had sat back and looked at her for a moment. "Clara," he said. It was the first time he had used her name, not Miss Bowden, Clara. She had looked at him across the desk that had been her father's. "James," she said. It was the first time she had used his. Neither of them said anything else for a moment, and then they had talked about something else entirely, and the afternoon had gone on, and the accounts had sat between them on the desk like something that had been settled. He had spoken to her formally in June. Not in the manner of a man making a business arrangement, which she had half expected, and had prepared herself for with the particular resigned practicality of a woman who knows her position, and has learned not to want more than position allows. He had not arrived with a solicitor or a prepared statement or a careful enumeration of practical benefits. He had arrived on a Tuesday, as usual, and they had had their tea and their conversation, and at some point in the late afternoon when the light was coming through the sitting-room window in the long golden way it did in June, he had simply stopped in the middle of a sentence about something else entirely and said, "I would like to marry you, Clara, not because of the ledgers, yours or mine, not because of anything practical, though God knows there are practical reasons on both sides if one wants to look for them." He had paused. "Because I come here every Tuesday, and on the Tuesdays I can't come. I think about the Tuesday when I can. Because you are the only person I know who tells me the truth without making it a weapon. Because you looked at me across your father's desk and used my name like it was just a name, not a title, and I have been thinking about that since May." Another pause, shorter. "And because I find, when I examine the question honestly, which you have made it considerably harder for me to avoid doing, that I have been falling in love with you since approximately the Alderton reception, and I would prefer, if you're willing, not to continue doing it from a distance." Clara had looked at him for a long moment. She had thought about her father's letter. She had thought about 14 names in a notebook. She had thought about a woman who had walked into a room and been told she wasn't worth remembering, and what that woman had done with it, and where it had brought her. "Yes," she said. Simply, completely. Without qualification or condition or any of the careful architecture she usually built around the things she wanted most. Just yes. They were married in September. Small, private, the church near her house in Kensington rather than the Ashworth family church in the country, because Clara had been quietly immovable on this point, and James had understood why without being told. Lady Mowbray was there. Ruth Hale was there with Sir Edmund, who had finally grown up enough to be good company. Francis Alderton was there, sharp-eyed and warm and wearing a hat that Clara would remember for the rest of her life. Margaret Pembroke was there and cried, which she would have denied to anyone who asked. The Duchess was there. She had arrived early and sat in the front pew, and when Clara walked in she had looked at her with an expression that Clara could not entirely read, which was unusual, because Clara could read most expressions by now. It was not the expression of a woman who had gotten what she wanted. It was not the expression of a woman who had lost. It was something more complicated than either. The expression, perhaps, of a woman who is intelligent enough to recognize when she has been outmaneuvered by someone worth being outmaneuvered by, and has decided, with the particular pragmatism of a long life, that this is the version of events she can live with. After the ceremony she had taken Clara's hands, as she had at the dinner in October of the previous year, and she had looked at her with those sharp, assessing eyes. "You are going to be very difficult," the Duchess said. "Yes, Your Grace," Clara said. "Good," the Duchess said after a moment. "He needs someone difficult." It was, Clara thought, the closest she was going to get to a blessing, and she accepted it as such. In October, she had given the ledgers to James. All 3 boxes, locked, complete, exactly as her father had kept them. She had carried them to his study herself and set them on his desk, and he had looked at them and then looked at her. "Clara, they belong with the estate records," she said. "They always did. My father kept them separately out of discretion, but you've seen the accounts now. You know what's in them. There's no reason for a locked box." He had been quiet for a moment. "Your father trusted my family with a great deal," he said, "and we didn't always deserve it." "No," Clara agreed, "but you're not your father and I'm not mine." She looked at the boxes on his desk. "Keep them properly. Have Fitch integrate them into the estate records. Close the accounts that are closed. Honor the ones that aren't." She paused. "That's all my father ever wanted. He just didn't want to ask for it." James had looked at her for a long moment. "I'll have Fitch begin next week," he said. "Good," she said. And she turned and left his study and went to find something useful to do, which was never difficult. The year had other things in it, smaller things, private things, the ordinary extraordinary business of 2 people learning to inhabit the same life without losing the particular shape of themselves. Arguments twice, both resolved. A dinner at which Clara sat at the head of the table for the first time and said nothing about what it felt like, because James was watching her from the other end with an expression that told her he already knew. A morning in November when she had found her father's pocket watch, which she had carried on her key ring for over a year, had stopped, and she had stood at her desk for 10 minutes doing nothing while the grief moved through her in its patient, reliable way. And James had come in to find her and had not said anything at all, had simply stood beside her with his hand over hers until it passed. She had not asked how he had known to do that. She had understood that he simply had. On the morning of the 19th of December, she finished her accounts and locked them in her drawer, in her desk, in the study that had always been hers, and remained hers by unspoken and complete agreement. And she went downstairs to find James already at the breakfast table with his coffee, and a letter he appeared to be reading with mild displeasure. "Fitch," he said without looking up. "What has he done?" Clara asked, pouring her tea. "Nothing. He wants my opinion on something that is entirely within his own competence to decide, and he's writing to me about it instead of deciding it, because he's been Fitch for 30 years and old habits don't reform easily." He set the letter down. "I'm going to write back and tell him to decide it himself." "Tell him, Miss Bow," she stopped, smiled slightly at her own habit. "Tell him I said so as well. He responds better to me." James looked at her across the breakfast table with the expression she had come to know as his most honest one. Not the composed, authoritative face, not the slightly guarded face he wore in public, but this one, which was quieter than all the others, and which she suspected very few people had ever seen. "The Duchess's dinner is tonight," he said. "I know," Clara said. "Are you ready?" She thought about the question. She thought about a woman who had sat near the middle of a table 14 months ago and counted 14 faces and folded their names into the back of her mind and gone home and held a wine glass with a perfectly steady hand. "I've been ready since October of last year," she said. "I'm simply going this time for different reasons." He smiled. It was a real smile, the one she had first seen in his study when he read her 4-line letter, sudden and unguarded and entirely unperformed. "Better ones?" he asked. Clara picked up her tea. "Much better ones," she said. That evening at the Ashworth Christmas dinner, Clara sat at the right hand of the Duke. Not near the middle. Not between a deaf viscountess and a nervous baronet. At his right hand, where she had been placed by the household and where she would be placed, she understood, at every table they sat at for the rest of their lives. The room was full of the same faces it had held the year before: Lady Mowbray, Frances Alderton, Ruth Hale, Margaret Pembroke, the others, 14 of them, the same 14, gathered again as they gathered every year in this room on this evening. They knew her name. Every one of them. She had made certain of that, quietly and patiently and without cruelty over the course of 14 months, armed with nothing but her father's ledgers, her own memory, and the absolute refusal to be forgotten by people who had decided, before she opened her mouth, that she was not worth remembering. The candles were lit. The first course arrived. Clara picked up her wine glass and looked down the long table at the faces she knew, and the candles she could have counted in her sleep, and the room that was, tonight and from now on, as much hers as anyone's. She did not count the candles. She did not count the faces. She simply sat at the table in her place and let the evening begin. 14 people were at that dinner. Every single one of them remembered her name by the end of that year. And so did he. Especially him. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.